So, hello and welcome to our Tapas and Pretzels podcast. Today, we also have a guest. That's Erik Wilde. As LinkedIn said or says, he is one of the top API development voices, but he has also a YouTube channel, so you can also check that out, where he explains something about APIs. And he also worked for the Open API initiative as an ambassador. And he also worked on the continuous API management book. You should also check that out. Yes. So thank you, Erik, that you're here. And I had just one question for you right now, or at the beginning. So you said something about that many organizations have different kind of approaches how to handle data or the API, or have different kind of processes. So can you tell me why this could be a problem? Like, do you have an example, or why is this necessary that they have to be in the same process?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me. It's really nice to be here and to see a couple of very familiar faces. Hi, everybody. And so this difference between APIs and data in my mind always is, well, first of all, I just find it confusing because to me, in the end, data is just kind of a subset of the API space, right? It's kind of and you can deliver API data through API, so why not do that? But I think the separation oftentimes I think has historical roots because oftentimes data was managed in a different way, and maybe you had data at rest somewhere, you had kind of files, and you would do non-API things with your data. More and more these days are over. And I think in the end, the problem nowadays actually is that if you treat those differently, you actually end up with two parallel governance structures, right? Where there are certain rules and regulations and certain tools and certain ways how things are done in the data space. And then there's the same stuff for the API space. And first of all, it's ineffective to do it like this because you kind of build this governance structure two times, even though you only need it once. And you run the risk of actually building it in possibly conflicting or non-interoperable ways, so that you now handle data in a certain way. But then if you now actually want an API around your data, then suddenly these two worlds collide, and the data people, so to speak, may do things differently, and the API people may actually want to have them done differently because there are certain governance structures around APIs. And then you end up in rather unproductive discussions what to do, except and instead of just saying, okay, we have the data, we want to build an API, so this is how we do it. So it just seems to me that this is more a historical separation than one that makes a lot of sense nowadays, but it's definitely one that you will find in pretty much any larger organization. It's still there.
I completely agree. I think that the APIs are only the tip of the iceberg. Before APIs are the means of exposing and consuming data. So those two areas are closely related. In fact, before thinking on how you expose data, you have to have a nice data architecture. Eric, let me ask you one thing. How do you think that gap between the API guys and the data guys can be filled? How do you how do you fill the gap?
They should meet more. oftentimes, oftentimes it's really completely different kind of branches of the organization, right?
Yeah.
There's the data people, and then there's like IT and processes, and that's like something completely different. And it just feels very strange why that is the case. So somebody needs to realize that this is maybe not great, and bring those groups together. And then you just need to figure out, okay, what are we currently doing with data? What are we currently doing with APIs and processes? And how can we better converge those two areas, right? And there are good signs. So one of the things I found really interesting when you look at data mesh, right? So data mesh is a pretty popular topic these days for how to manage your data. And when you look what data mesh really is, and I don't want to say that they copied it, so to speak, right? But it has the exact same guidelines or recommendations that you would have for modern API management, right? Like more federation of individual things. And it says data mesh is not just technology, it's also around teams and like cultural parts of how data is being managed, right? So the interesting bit there, I think, is that data mesh in the end does exactly the same things as modern API management. It's just a different name in the data world, right?
But
So I think sometimes actually these groups might not be as far apart as it might seem, but I think it would still be very valuable if they talked more and had easier ways of creating one model of how information assets are being managed instead of sticking with that kind of old school separation.
no, totally agree. I think, as you said it very well, because of the historical evolution of things. I mean, data mesh is basically an evolution of like this enterprise data warehouses into data lakes into data mesh, because then the people discovered like that the social aspect is not working, or the technology is scaling, but like the people side and process side is not scaling enough. And we have the same with the monolith in the beginning, and then we decoupled monolith into multiple microservice service-oriented architecture. I think the API side was quicker, and the data side is now following up. And I think it's a matter of time. Once companies start adapting the data mesh principles, um, we will see like both merging together. Yeah, totally agree. But what is your
It
thinking on?
reminds me of that advertisement. Sorry, reminds me of this advertisement for the Swiss candies, the Ricola, where it's like, who invented it? We invented it. And it's the Swiss advertisement. And you could say maybe the API people were a little bit quicker, but it doesn't matter, right? I think the interesting part is that both camps, so to speak, discovered the same principles, and I would say on their own, right? But that's a good validation, actually, that this probably makes sense, right? If two groups discover the same things, that's a good sign that it's probably actually valid.
No, absolutely. And that brings me to my question: like, where do you see like these companies adapting more to data mesh? Is it like these traditional companies that has currently data lakes and fail to scale, or are these companies that are way more mature in the API space? Which of those companies are more likely to adapt towards the data mesh? What do we think?
I mean, I've read articles. I have to say, I'm not a data mesh expert, right? So I come from the API side, so to speak. But I've read some articles where people claimed that actually a lot of organizations are not at the level of maturity that they would need to be to really implement data mesh, right? And the argument I found relatively plausible, because the argument oftentimes was that this idea of, which also is the same for like modern API management, right? Like breaking things into microservices and these kind of things. I mean, it's very demanding. It's not something that every organization can easily do. It requires very different team setups, different skill sets, different ways how you build teams, like cross-functional teams and these kind of things. And that's not in place in many organizations, right? And doing that is a lot of change management, and change management is hard and costs time. So I think there probably is a case to be made that for a lot of organizations, you cannot just go in and say, oh, let's do data mesh, right? It's the same as walking into a company and say, well, let's do microservices, or let's do agile, right? Like all these things where it's like, yeah, okay. First of all, right, let's ask the Spice Girls questions. Right? That's always important. Right? Like, why are we even talking about this? Right? It's like, what are you actually trying to do? Like, data mesh should not be a goal, right? Like, the goal hopefully is something business related, and
Mhm.
then maybe data mesh is a way of reaching that goal. And so that's the first thing, right? It's like asking yourself, why are we even talking about this? And then the second would be, is like, okay, if this is the goal, then where are we, and what can we do as a organization that functions as it is currently functioning, and what are the options that are realistic for us, instead of saying, well, this is great, but unfortunately we cannot really do it because we would need a completely different team structure to do it, and that is probably not going to happen from one day to the other.
Okay, and what do you think is the role that AI play here? The adoption of AI will raise some risk. You know, AI consumes data from everywhere. It also has great integration requirements. So, in your opinion, which is the role of AI here? How do you think that the AI will help to fill that gap between data and API people?
Okay, I'll pull a Spice Girls again, right? So AI also is like,
You know, I
why?
love that question. So
No, but it's really like, I mean, sometimes people, it's the same thing, right? Let's do AI because
yeah,
AI, and it's like, that's not a valid reason, right? Tell me more. Um, but let's say there is a valid reason why you think that AI may be something for you. And I mean, at that level, I would just say that AI, if you choose to invest in AI because you actually have good reasons for it, um, then that will probably put more pressure on your organization to improve data management and API management, all these kind of things, because you will need to use more data, expose more data, and make that available to those things that you want to build. So, in the end, I mean, the role of AI assisted things, I think, I mean, role is almost said too much, but those might just be factors that accelerate that development, because you have more people who say, hey, we probably should be better with our data because we want to do those things with it, and currently we can't get to the data because it's somewhere in a place where we cannot easily build stuff with it, so we have to fix that.
Absolutely. I mean, once the company recognizes that this might be a value stream, that it can really make money with data, that, or with AI, it's obviously that you invest resources, like people that do actually the management, the governance, and everything. So even then, because just to have an AI in the company without value doesn't justify to get people on board and pay people for doing management stuff. Usually, totally agree. Yeah. And what is your thinking
Yeah, I
of?
mean, if everything works well, then I mean, there's no need to renovate things if everything works well, right? So if even if you run, let's say, old school, if that works for your company, well, just keep doing that, right? No need to change. But if there are pressures where you need to change things for like valid business reasons, then start looking into where you're where you have the most potential, right? And I think that oftentimes a lot of organizations are, and we see that more and more, a lot of organizations are starting with kind of assessments where they just want to know more. It's like, how are we doing, right? Like, how are practices, where are we kind of maybe where most companies are, where are we maybe lagging, and then that gives them some indication of maybe investing in certain areas first if they think they should improve their practices. So that's something that we see happening quite a bit, that there are these kind of assessments where organizations want to just learn more about how they're currently dealing with things, and where they might want to be in the future.
What is your feeling, since we strive the topic of data mesh? What in and get back to the API topic, like what is your perception of API contracts or API developer portals that offer API contracts and this whole data contract movement? Do you see similarities, or do you feel it's something completely new?
To be honest, I have not invested enough time to really look deeply into data contracts. I know that, I mean, there are a couple of flavors out there, as far as I know. There is one from like InnoQ in Germany, which I think is modeled a little bit after OpenAPI to some extent, but it is slightly different, of course, because it's about data and not about endpoints in an API. And I oftentimes, when I read about data contracts, there is more emphasis on semantics. So really have like a rich semantic description of what something actually means according to some taxonomy or ontology or whatever framework that you have for capturing meaning. So there seems to be a bigger emphasis on this. In the API space, I would say this kind of faded away. There was a time where people were talking about semantic web services and these kind of things. That really hasn't caught on, I would say. Right now, we're very much on a syntactic level where what you do is you say, here are my endpoints, here's what they do in HTTP, here are the JSON schema descriptions. What that JSON means, you have no idea, right? There's documentation that you can read, but there's no machine readable way to find out what the data fields actually mean. And I think in the data contract world, there's a little bit more emphasis on this, right? Because I think there in the data space, typically there is this goal to be able to merge data and understand where things can be matched between data sets. And that is only possible when you know what the data actually means. So I think there are some differences, but I would hope that just like maybe data mesh and kind of modern API management, maybe API descriptions and data contracts also can actually figure out that they have a whole lot in common, and that handling those in a little bit more unified way may be a good idea.
Okay, and finally, apart from the Spice Girls questions, answering the question, which are your final remarks and your advices to someone willing to deal with data meshes and APIs?
That's a pretty ambitious question. Well, I'd say so. So if you're in a large organization, right, I would say it definitely is worth a try, at least to just try to understand what are we doing on the API side of things? What are we doing on the data side of things? Are there any attempts to unify those at least a little bit? And to try that, it's probably hard. There is a very, very, very long history of these things being treated differently. People talk different languages, right? They cannot even really talk to each other because they have different lingo. And so it's actually hard, right? It's always hard to try to build bridges between two communities that have been separated for quite a while. But I think that could be definitely worth it. And the other thing that I think also would make a lot of sense is for kind of us API people, so to speak, to look more at the data space and see what's happening there, and learn from it, maybe, right? And see, okay, they're doing interesting things, we're not doing something like this, so maybe we can learn from that. And then in the same way, for the people in the data space to look at the API side of things and also look at, well, what's happening there, right? Is there maybe something we can learn from? And I think that over time will also just naturally lead to a certain convergence of those things. And I don't think this is going to go away anytime soon. There is a very, very long history of those things being treated differently. But at least being aware that there are these parallel things in many places, and at least trying to start better to understand both sides and to bridge that gap a little bit, that I think at least is a first step that can bring us a little bit closer to unifying these two worlds in a way.
Okay, then, as you said, just talk more to each other, maybe with a dinner, maybe also with tapas and pretzels, who knows? And thank you for your insights, Erik. It was a pleasure that you were here. So then we will see us. We will see us at the next podcast, and goodbye.
Bye, everybody.